We're here at the Royal British Society of Sculptors to speak to the winner of the 2014 Brian Mercer Stone Carving Residency, Alice Cunningham. This exhibition is the result of a 3-month residency that you won at the Fondazione Sem in Pietrasanta in Italy, and you were exploring and working with the marble from Michelangelo's quarry. Can you tell us a bit about the residency and your work that you made there?
Well, I was completely thrilled to get the opportunity to go. It's an opportunity that they hold every year as part of the Royal British Sculpture Society, and they send one sculptor to go and work with marble, and they send one sculptor to work with bronze for 3 months. And the stone residency is in Studio Sem in Pietrasanta. Sem, who the studio is named after, was one of the sort of forefront of contemporary marble sculpture in that area. So he gave the first bit of stone to Henry Moore, and was the first guy in charge of a workshop who started giving marble to contemporary artists with the trust that people would make interesting forms and allowing abstract forms to be made, moving away from the sort of religious sculpture that was traditional in the area. So it's always had a history of supporting young artists, and I was completely thrilled to be chosen to go there. Very sort of prestigious opportunity. And I was obviously a bit intimidated. Anything to do with Michelangelo, being a sculptor, is quite foreboding. But it was incredible and cheesy but true, life-changing experience to be there for 3 months in that environment, surrounded by such high-level craftsmanship and artists.
How many people are there at any one time?
There's about 5 or 6 artisans who work in the studio, in specifically Studio Sem, and then there's and they are there every day supporting the artists, and then there's about 4 or so artists who have permanent studios in Sem, and then there's at any one time I'd say there's about 15 people working around the sort of courtyard. It's all open plan studio, and yeah, they're artists from literally all over the world. It's an amazing sort of melting pot of people working.
And you were the youngest woman to have won this residency.
Yeah.
Were you the youngest? I mean,
There was one guy before me who was the youngest, who did the residency the year before I did. But yeah, I was sort of, again, looking back at the previous artists, realised that they're all quite a lot more established than me. So yeah, that sort of could be healthy pressure and intimidation about doing it, but especially there, because it's a lot of the artists there have been working with stone for a long time.
And what's the gender divide like generally there as well?
The studio is run by a woman, which is unusual in that area, and she's American, which is again unusual because there's a real sort of family tradition handed down within that industry. The people that run the quarries traditionally are families, as are the stone workshops. So that in itself is quite unusual, and I think makes without again sounding too cheesy, but I think there's a real sort of family atmosphere created because of that, and because of the way that Kira runs the workshop.
How long had you been working with marble before you went?
I hadn't.
Oh, you hadn't?
No, I hadn't. I'd worked with it for a very short time in Zambia before, just for a few weeks assisting marble artists there. And I'd worked with limestone for 1 or 2 pieces, but not for any period of time really, just experimenting. So it was my first chance, which is the opportunity sort of specifically geared for people that haven't had the facility or support to work with it, because obviously you need, just to turn around a piece of stone and to make a few cuts, you need a lot of gear, you need a lot of setup, you need extraction and lifting equipment, and so that's kind of what the residency is for, is to allow you to really go for it. So this was the first piece that I made, and the stone before I cut it was like a slice of cake. It was just like a big wedge, and I chose it because it had this really beautiful natural surface, and I wanted to retain that and experiment with contrasting the natural surface against the cut line while I was sort of figuring out how to work with marble and its limitations. And so this this piece was sort of selected because of that shape, and also because it suggested a bit of a wave and a pressure to me. After looking into the way that marble is formed, it starts off as limestone, and then it's just because it's under intense heat and pressure that it becomes marble. So I thought, again, to link into sort of its own process, this form of the wave would be really nice to work with. And then I literally just opened it up. And I guess it's a bit symptomatic of my sort of excavation of the stone and of the material, and cutting my teeth on it. And so I sort of went inside it and defined this area to be as if it was a wave. And these carved in these lines here, which are sort of longitude and latitude lines, to talk a bit about the way that we quantify the landscape, and mirroring a bit of the geometry of the quarries and the process up there. But then I sort of put in some softer lines, which is a bit of a jugular vein here for me, sort of sensitive details. So yeah, I was sort of just experimenting with this piece, but I do really enjoy the movement. Lots of people are very nervous that it's fragile, but it's actually not fragile at all. The material's incredibly hard.
So did you have in your mind what you wanted to make and what you wanted the pieces to look like?
No, not at all. I had no idea what they were going to look like. I knew that I wanted to work with, I knew I wanted to be really responsive to the material, and I knew that I wanted to really be as site specific as possible and responsive to what I discovered with the material, because, you know, it's a new material for me to really get into. And I knew I wanted to work with this idea of sort of surface and almost a bit painterly. So work with line and surface, and those were the sort of ideas that I had in mind. But I wasn't really sure what they were going to be like. And I think the quarries were the biggest inspiration when I actually got there, which I never expected. So
the piece that you're standing by now is actually based on the quarry. Do you want to tell us a bit about this piece?
Yeah. So I, when I first got there, the director of the studio took me up to the quarries to look at stone and to talk to me about the industry, and I was really hit by the form of the extraction, how they did it, and the geometry versus the sort of natural landscape, geometry of how they cut the stone out of the mountain versus the natural sort of texture and lines there. So I did lots of drawings and I took lots of photographs of all of that, and ended up going to a lot of quarries in the area. And then I discovered that there was a guy in a different workshop who was working with a robotic arm, and that was an interesting thing for me to wonder what a human hand could bring to a sculpture and what a robotic hand could. So we started talking about, I put together this image which was of the quarry skyline mirrored with the natural mountain skyline. And I took it to him and started talking about what that would look like as a three-dimensional object. And he was really excited about that because he'd only ever worked with models before, scaling up models and using the robot to do that, not from a two-dimensional image. So he was sort of excited by the potential of that. So this is what we ended up creating from that. So we turned the two-dimensional photograph into a 3D image on the computer, and then fed that to a robotic arm that had a grinder attached to it, and it roughed out this shape. And then the piece came back to me. There's a part under here that you can see which has hundreds of lines on it, and when the piece came back, the whole piece was covered in all of these lines, like you would a printing, you know, when a printer runs out of ink or something. So the whole thing was covered in those lines. So I then had to carve it back and decide on how I was going to finish it. So it was a nice collaboration between a robotic arm and a human arm. And
does it make any comment, do you think, on man's impact on the landscape?
I think that's for the viewer to say. I don't know. I hope so. You know, it was my sort of. I was opening up the discussion of that, and also the just the different finishes, the way that I finished the two sides. This side being much more organic, and this side literally using the chisel to finish, where you can still see all the marks. So I wanted to sort of discuss that as an aesthetic as much as how we treat materials, how humans sort of work with materials. And I think it's kind of a nice poetry for me in this, that it's taken from the shapes of the quarry in the mountains and using the material that comes from the quarry in the mountains. So it sort of refers back to itself being a collaboration with a robot as well.
Yeah.
So,
which side is harder to make? I mean, the geometric side or?
Yeah, but you have to have a lot more control on this side, because to get really straight lines with a pneumatic hammer and chisel is you know, you have to be very precise on this side. This side's kind of fun because you can just enjoy the shapes and yeah. So this was a piece that I chose from, we went up to the quarry and I wanted a piece that was had a natural surface on all sides. So we had to go up to the quarry to select the stone because the way that they quantify the stone to know the quality of it is they always cut it before they bring it down from the mountain. Most of the stones that you'll start working with always have a cut side, but I wanted one that had a nice, really nice natural sort of form and surface on all sides. So we went up to the quarry to choose this one. And then I wanted to make a series of cuts that were sensitive to the form as a whole, but also highly, highly finish the surface so that it contrasted against this natural surface. But yeah, I was kind of very ambitious in some of the cuts. And working with this one in particular was, you know, putting an angle grinder in there, and then you just get all the dust coming straight back into your face. So it's kind of creating a bit of an air vent. But it's a beautiful thing to be sensitive to the form and the surface as a whole.